Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L coming in with a Reincarnated as a Slime video. This time specifically, I am catching up with the things I should have been doing. I am making a comparison video for the Rimuru vs Hinata fight, one of the best fights for Volume 4 and 5. This video is going to let you know some of the little details that the anime unfortunately couldn't maintain because of the way that slime is told, and it will also explain a little bit of gluttony as it works in Volume 5. And I will have a time code for the people who want to just go to the gluttony explanation for Volume 5. Anyway, everyone, thank you so much for watching, and let's just get right into it. Anyway, as we know, in the anime, Hinata came up to Rimuru and they had an epic awesome fight, with Hinata motivated to get revenge for her teacher. This leads into a general situation where Hinata really isn't listening to Rimuru. In the anime, right after Hinata said she didn't care about Rimuru's words and struck Rimuru, he said, "If my nervous system weren't directly connected to my brain, that would have broken skin. Sucks that they took magic sense from me." So this little segment tells us just how close to danger Rimuru was. It's just saying that Rimuru's reflexes are better than most people because of the way that the nervous system interacts with him. Anyway, moving on to the next change, there's a slight difference that occurred when Rimuru told Hinata that he was from Japan. In the novel, he spoke in Japanese, and you can read what he said down below. So in this case, what the anime did was they streamlined, which was a really good move. In the novel, it's easy to indicate that they were speaking a different language and then Rimuru switched to Japanese, but in the anime, because you're already speaking the language, it's kind of tough. There was a reaction to what Hinata said above, and it has to do with the intel aspect of all this. Because of the way the anime set this up, Rimuru's full thoughts didn't really get to come out, but here's the rest of what he thought. Does whoever leaked word about me to Hinata know I was Japanese? Because only a handful of people did. Or did she think I could speak Japanese because I claimed to be from there? Or was she just told that I killed Shizu and inferred that I must have known about other worlds and learned Japanese? That's not just blind guesswork, that's more calculated. So it's actually really interesting to see how many different possibilities Rimuru was parsing. And this is going to be another thing that you're going to notice about this fight. The anime doesn't really get to show it, and the few moments that they actually do show of Rimuru having internal dialogue were pretty good, but there was just so much more missing. But had they actually adapted everything that Rimuru was thinking, anime viewers would have 100% been confused. Moving on, third little difference is that when Rimuru was asking Hinata if she was sure she wanted to fight him, he was thinking that there was no way he would lose. The fourth little difference comes from the fact that Rimuru really thinks about a lot of things when it comes down to it. In the anime, we really only get a couple of lines, but in the light novel, we get a few more interesting details at this moment. All my initiative was gone. I've been trying for a while, but Dark Flame and Dark Thunder still weren't working. Neither was Universal Shapeshift, not without the magic to drive it. Simply maintaining my current body was enough of an ordeal, and with Hellflare similarly offline, I had no ace in the hole to rely on. So as you can see here, we learn of what Rimuru was trying, and we also learn he was having trouble with the current body, which makes it more impressive that he was still able to dodge Hinata while going through said ordeal. Anyway, moving on, the next segment happens around this scene where Rimuru just added in what the barrier was likely used for, noting it was something that would help the Crusaders. If I had to guess, this was a line that just served to build up the Crusaders and what they did. Moving on, quick little thing, but during this stage of the clash, Rimuru noted that only Hakuro had this kind of sheer, overwhelming force that Hinata had. And this led to a bigger thing at around this sequence where Rimuru had used many skills on himself. In the anime, you see some of the skills, but there were a few more details. He had used Battle Will first to improve his other physical skills, the ones that he subsequently used. And then he concluded that anything he activated using his internal magic supply was still accessible. Here, when Hinata countered, Rimuru had this moment where he noted she was observing him closely. The bigger thing was that Rimuru was shocked that she didn't underestimate him and was essentially treating him with respect as a threat. Rimuru once more compared Hinata's skill to Hakuro's, and the comparisons to Hakuro were all throughout the fight, and that might just be because the writer wanted to make sure that it was understood that Hakuro would always stand at the top of skill discussions. Moving on, the next bit happens around Ifrit's summoning. In the anime, Great Sage jumped to it pretty quickly, but in the novel, Rimuru's desperation was a tiny bit more dragged out with the text you can see below. All this segment did was show Rimuru's thought process and show that he wasn't a slouch while he was looking for a solution. There's a certain level of desperation that comes out a little bit more clearly in the light novel than it did in the anime. Moving on, the next thing I want to cover is the magic corridor. When I first watched the episode, I was confused about what this was. I felt really bad because maybe I had forgotten between seasons. but thankfully the novel was much more user-friendly, and because of that I'm going to give you the explanation that the novel gave us. Elementals had to run on the magical force of the summoner, but Ifrit and I had a channel of magic running between us, so that was no problem. My energy converted itself into an elemental force, flowing freely into the spirit. So now with that, it made more sense as to why the circuit or corridor existed for those people who had no idea what was going on. Anyway, at this point, we're transitioning into the gluttony half of the fight. And before continuing, we're going to cover gluttony in full as told to us by Volume 5, because there's a few things here. At this stage, gluttony is a unique skill, and the light novel calls it glutton, or calls the being that comes out of it the glutton. So just to give you a quick reminder from an earlier novel, gluttony is made up of 7 abilities: predation, stomach, mimic, isolate, corrode or rot, receive, and provide. All these play a part in how gluttony has access to the monsters that make it up. So moving into gluttony's mechanics, gluttony is similar to early Great Sage in that it's robotic or program-like when it's unleashed. What that is to say is that when it starts moving, it's acting on its own instinct-based intelligence. Rimuru compares it to a virus, though he notes it is driven to consume everything in sight. For this instance of gluttony, Rimuru notes that he let it go out of control, and he linked it to Great Sage, but also noted that it was acting of its own volition, which again is most likely very instinctual in nature. Now, it's important to note, gluttony, there's no real indicator where exactly gluttony's will comes from, since Rimuru notes it acts on its own accord. And what's worse, at one point, Rimuru contradicts himself in the translation. In one line, he says gluttony has no will, and afterwards, he says it was acting on its own volition. So there's a good chance in the translation itself, there's some weird nuance that's being lost from the Japanese. Just know, it doesn't have a sophisticated will. If we just understand that it's programmed by instinct, I think it's all good. Gluttony gains its form through the universal shapeshift skill. It was noted that the glutton absorbs the grass, the earth, and the air to help make the form that we saw, sort of like those things with raw materials. And then Rimuru noted, in regards to why gluttony was able to change shape, that universal shapeshift was behind it, and it let him transform into the useful aspects of every creature he consumed in the past. Recall though, Rimuru mentioned that he was not able to use universal shapeshift, which is why they had to mention the thing about using the surroundings as raw materials. They have one more note about this coming up. Anyway, the reason why you saw gluttony in the current shape was just flat out because this thing was made for battle. Now, when you were getting this in the novel, Rimuru then moved on into covering just why he was able to transform. Do remember from earlier that skills using Rimuru's internal magic still work. So, the glutton, normally it would have had a body made of magic, but because that was limited, the glutton made the body by taking the physical components mentioned earlier. How it was able to do this? Well, it was not by using ambient magic, that's for sure. Now, moving away from that, in regards to how the glutton perceives the world, we know that the glutton can approach and find prey by using sound, heat, and scent. Next, to understand gluttony's composition when it comes to slime's jargon, gluttony has no spirit and no will aside from the instinctual drive. Rimuru notes, however, that gluttony does have a soul. Then it's noted that gluttony has an astral body because that's where thoughts are contained. When gluttony dies, it's because disintegrate wipes out souls as well as the physical components that make up its body. Now, with that said, let me just give you the rundown on souls and spirits. You probably saw my note about translations earlier. In general, it looks like in Reincarnated as a Slime, the bodies a creature has are layered upon each other like an onion with the soul at the root. And again, everything I'm going to tell you here is based off of the Yen Press novel translation, the official translation. The majority will be word for word what the translation says. Gluttony had no spirit, no will of its own. It was a soul in its purest form. A soul is consciousness by Slime's definition. The soul or consciousness doesn't have any way to express itself by just existing. That's why it has an astral body. The astral body contains the soul. But the astral body can't contain memory, and that's where the spirit comes in. Rimuru says that the memories in the spirit are temporary memories, and he calls it virtual memory. If you know programming, that's what he's referring to. Anyway, that's where the physical body comes in. The physical body can store permanent memory, and as you can guess, the physical body is the outermost layer of the body onion. Rimuru also made the note that if the spirit is damaged, in other words, the spiritual body is damaged, it would be likely that the astral body would be wounded as well, and if that wound reached the soul, resurrection would no longer be possible. So just giving you an idea of what happens if things penetrate. Fun fact, Hinata used Astral Bind against the Glutton because the Glutton still had an astral body. The reason it didn't work was just because the Glutton was able to overpower it. Okay, so with that info out of the way, let's quickly go through any big changes for this segment of the fight. And the first thing I want to talk about, the shift in the order that occurred. In the novel, the story jumped from the activation of Gluttony to Rimuru celebrating surviving and then showing Rimuru play back the recording of Gluttony's fight. With regards to the recording, here's how Rimuru refers to it. That's what the battle record told me. I was watching from the side as if it was on TV or something, and it was simply breathtaking. Anyway, through this segment, we found out that Rimuru made the clone the moment the barrier happened. In Rimuru's words, "When I was locked up in that holy field that put me at one hell of a disadvantage, trying to hold my own in combat there with no idea who I was fighting or how strong they were would have been idiotic." So good to know that by light novel standard, anime Rimuru is idiotic for doing this fight for so long the way the anime depicted it. But mind you, the anime had a tough job here just because this is really awkward to even try to animate in sequence. It just looks really odd, especially with what the anime was doing with the other scenes at this moment in time. So I can understand why the anime went the way they did on this one. Anyway, interestingly, Rimuru went on to say that his magic body couldn't move too quickly, which again is another strange thing to say given that the speed was still high in that fight. But I guess you can kinda get what was meant. What Rimuru was saying was that the magic body, the magic duplicate he made, was ultimately having some control issues. Thank God that one had great reflexes. Anyway, moving on, during Rimuru's "Oh my god I survived" phase, Rimuru made some observations. He was glad that he listened to Hakuro and trained Form Hide, and he noted that if Hinata considered replication, Rimuru would have been in trouble, which just says again that Hinata underestimated Rimuru. Anyway, speaking of the anime's choices here, some of Hinata's lines when she was there observing Gluttony's product were there to explain what Rimuru had told the readers through just natural narration. It was actually pretty neat, and it was pretty smart to have Hinata there. Another detail, before Hinata launched the spirits, she had this whole bit where she talked about how Rimuru was already dead and that he was pestering her after death. She decided to wipe him out because the Glutton could threaten the world, and of course, how she comes to that conclusion, that's just something she just comes to naturally through the fight. Now, after that stage, Rimuru starts talking about Disintegrate and how he couldn't get a lot of info on that. During that process, Rimuru says that the barrier that was used for that stage of the fight had a heat-seeking property, though we didn't really get to see it. What he was pretty much saying was that that thing was going to track onto you no matter how much you moved. One last little detail was that Rimuru described the Glutton as unconscious, unthinking, and pitiful. At the end, Rimuru joked around that if you squinted really hard, you could call this a tactical victory. This was a lighthearted way of ending the fight, and ultimately just said that Rimuru was using the replicant to gain combat information. And when you look at it from the perspective of the light novel, he definitely did a good job getting information out of it. At that point, it is worth pointing out that the early segment before we go into the segment where we reveal that Rimuru was safe the entire time, the narration was coming from the duplicate, which is kind of interesting to consider. Anyway, that's the end of the Hinata versus Rimuru fight. There were a lot of little things going into it, but most of it was just explaining the magic that was happening behind the scenes. But anyway, if you found this a little bit confusing, join the club. Me too. The order with which it happened, even looking at the official translation, it's just there's so much happening, and a part of that might just be coming out of Slime having its own unique jargon for things that are happening. But guys, let me know what you thought down below. I hope this video gave you some nice little trivia, and keep your eyes peeled for any more Slime content. It's going to be one of the series I cover for the rest of the year. Anyway, everyone, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, I hope you have an absolutely